Recently, a friend forwarded me a Reddit thread, which I'll link in the description below, that said the following. If no D&D is better than bad D&D, then how do new or bad DMs get better? Newish DM here, struggling to not have my second group fall apart due to my lack of skill and experience at DMing. Both groups are made up of close friends of mine playing weekly. One group was online and the other in person. The online group was roleplay and improv heavy. The in-person group far less so. Both groups had long expressed interest in playing, and I fear I've killed all interest from both groups with how bad I am as DM. Now sure, maybe I've improved to some degree at this point, but it appears maybe to be too little too late, as the online group decided watching sports was too important to push aside for D&D. Now my in-person group has also decided weekly sessions are too often, 4-hour sessions are too long, and nobody ever shows up consistently. They're all trying to be polite and not insult me, but they refuse to give any feedback and insist that it's still fun, but they're literally passing out in front of me at the table or playing around on their phone. It feels like I'm doing a lot of work and getting nothing in return, but increased resistance and disinterest as I desperately try to hold it all together. So, if even longtime friends don't have the patience for bad D&D, what am I supposed to do? I'm spending so much money and 95% of my free time trying to study and get better, but it seems the only way to really get better is to play more. How do I play more when my groups can't stand putting in the bare minimum for my games? I'd like to avoid having to play with a bunch of strangers, but I imagine that's the only advice I'm going to get from most. I also see it as not the most helpful because every table is different, and what works for online play or for those specific players may be wildly different from what my other players may enjoy. Now I think at the top of the thread, the question that's ultimately posed is a reasonable one and one worth diving into. If no D&D is better than bad D&D, well, if you're unskilled as a game master or new, how are you supposed to improve? Hi, I'm John. This is Dragon Mind, where we discover our best selves through gaming. And today we're asking the question, is no D&D really better than bad D&D? Let's get into it. To start our discussion today, the first thing I think we really need to get on the same page about is what we mean when we say bad D&D. As one of the top commenters on this thread aptly points out, this advice isn't meant for the in-game experience. It's meant for the out-of-game experience. From my understanding, this notion that no D&D is better than bad D&D originates from horror stories that have been posted on the internet that are explored by other YouTubers like Crit Crab. These horror stories often have extreme examples of toxic behavior, from harassment to racism to occasionally physical danger. As more and more of these extreme cases started popping up online, a popular response became no D&D is better than bad D&D. In other words, if participating in a game is unsafe, either psychologically or physically, then it's better not to play than to subject yourself to a toxic environment. Of course, this is a catchy phrase, and so it is often used outside of this original specific context. This Reddit post is a great example. When OP is talking about bad D&D, they're talking about the quality of their ability as a GM, not some toxic over-the-line behavior. For this reason, I'm going to get a little more specific about when we talk about bad D&D. I'm going to call it unsatisfying D&D, as opposed to toxic D&D. As you can imagine, unsatisfying D&D is far more common than issues of physical safety. And as I think OP has already intuited, this notion of just don't play D&D if it's bad isn't quite appropriate in this context. Now, before I dive into any potential solutions or my view of this situation, first, I think it would be helpful to identify what unsatisfying D&D looks like. Now, what I'm going to describe is far from a comprehensive list. If I've missed an element or characteristic, please let me know in the comments down below. From my years of GMing, I found that the characteristics of unsatisfying D&D include disruption, imbalance, incompetence, manipulation, insecurity, and personality mismatch. Now, before I describe the meaning of those terms, I do want to say that satisfying D&D is not the absence of these elements. Every table I've been a part of, either as a GM or as a player, has at some point had each of these things kind of poke their head out. Our goal is not their complete elimination, but rather recognizing when they come up, what degree that they're coming up, and how we can dynamically adjust our approach to alleviate any unnecessary tension that may be the result of them. So to dive in, let's start with disruption. Disruption is anything that distracts from the game you're playing. Whether, like in OP's case, it's players watching sports or playing on their phones, even having side conversations, or maybe it's one player having a cathartic moment only for it to be robbed by another player joking about it. This one can be particularly frustrating for game masters that have spent a lot of time prepping details about their session, only for players to miss them and maybe even affect the outcome of the story because their attention is drawn elsewhere. Sometimes what happens is if distractions are frequent enough, game masters will sometimes just forego prepping their games, which can lead to a drop of quality, which makes the players care less, so the GM prepares less, and soon the game itself just kind of dissolves. Now, of course, there's the flip side of this coin to consider, which is imbalance, or in other words, a disproportionate amount of attention on something or someone. For example, I'm sure you can imagine tables where the GM just goes on and on and on about their descriptions. You're sitting down for a 2-hour game, and it feels like 90 minutes is spent on the GM describing the intricate dwarven bricklaying patterns of the castle you're approaching that you don't even get to enter. If a GM isn't good at reading the room, it can lead to players getting bored and trying to stimulate themselves with something else, like their phones or like a football game or a side conversation. That's a case of the GM spending disproportionate time on their own content rather than focusing on the important part, letting the players play. Now, even more potentially damaging is if a GM kind of locks on to a favorite player. I just remember a friend telling me about a table they were a part of, where outside of the game, a lot of the other players were just feeling that one of the players was the clear favorite. They always got the best magic items, always had some sort of backstory tie-in, and were given the most significant moments. It felt like their story mattered more than the other player characters. After a few weeks of this was brought to the attention of the GM, and the GM's reply was, well, yeah, this one player is the one that's engaging with the story I'm telling. So yes, I'm going to reward their engagement. The GM's perspective was that if the other players were more engaged, they'd get more stuff too. But instead, they felt excluded, and the things they tried to contribute ended up getting overlooked. As you can imagine, this group didn't stay together long after that. Now, I'm not saying that in every session, every player needs an equal amount of attention. There have been some times I've run games where I give a player an invite to join a scene or contribute in some way, and they've declined my invitation. Or it could be that for this particular session, one of the characters is fighting their arch rival, or the story takes place in their hometown. In that session, that player may get a little bit more attention, but that doesn't mean the other player characters can't contribute or give their 2 cents, or have their turn in the spotlight for the next adventure. One question that I frequently ask myself when I start to feel there might be an imbalance is, if a certain player character were not present for this story, would the story be significantly different? If the answer is no, that means that player character didn't really contribute. And when you start from there, you can start to assess, was I overlooking them? Did I not give them enough invites to participate? Or did that player decline my invitation? Or maybe they were spaced out, there was something else going on in their lives that they weren't able to give this game their full attention. That being said, we're going to move on to the characteristic that has probably the meanest name, which is incompetence. This is where the game loses momentum because of an unnecessary slowdown in mechanical resolutions. For example, on the player side, it might look something like this. All right, so I gotta make my attack roll. Oh wait, that wasn't the right one. That's the D12. Okay, I need the D20. This one, okay. Ooh, I got a 12. Does a 12 hit? Oh, add my attack bonus. +5, it'd be a 17. 17, I hit it. Is it dead? Damage, oh, okay, that'd be, 6-sided, I got it. Ooh, 2, okay. Oh, damage bonus. +3, 5 damage. Now, I do want to clarify, the key word here is unnecessary. As in, if that were a brand new player that had never played a TTRPG before, it's reasonable. They need time and space to learn where all their things are on their character sheet, what the different die look like. But if you're talking about the same player that's been in several combat situations for 6 months of play, and that's still what's going on, that can end up getting really frustrating for the other players at the table. This also goes for GMs. Again, I'm not saying every GM needs to learn and memorize every single rule of the system. But if you're frequently pausing the action in a game that's promised to be some critical role-like epic campaign to look up how swimming works, then yeah, your players might end up getting bored and start building dice towers or playing on their phones or having other distractions. The real world time it takes you and your players to resolve mechanics has a huge impact on how enjoyable a game is. Kind of like my last video on the 3-step prep method. I even ingrained this principle right into prep. How long are we expected to play for? How much gameplay and story do I need to tell in that space of time? And am I giving myself any buffers or rest points so that my players can be in the freshest mental state possible to enjoy what I've prepared for them? Of course, like disruption and imbalance, the flip side to incompetence is manipulation. Using the game's rules in a way that's a detriment to the spirit of the game. This is where your rules lawyers would be categorized. You know, a player goes to try something cool or creative that's outside the bounds of a spell or ability, and they go, actually, the way the rules as written work, that can't happen, even if the GM wanted to allow it. Sometimes what I find even more frustrating is the opposite, where they create some cockamamie argument based on some disparate rules of the game in order to get some foolish outcome. My go-to example for this is the so-called village cannonball. Let's say you have a village of, for the sake of argument, 100 villagers, and they have a target, like a target creature that's coming at them. All right, so what the villagers do is all 100 of them create a single file line. The 98 villagers in the middle all take the ready action for when a cannonball is passed from the first villager to the next one, their action is to use an object to pass it to the next villager. The first villager goes, the cannonball makes its way across the single file line, and when it gets to the 100th villager, that villager throws it at the target. Well, according to the game's rules, each round of combat is 6 seconds. If we space the villagers correctly, it means that the cannonball is moving a great distance over 6 seconds, to the point that when the 100th villager throws it, it's accelerating at this specific rate and obliterates the goblin that's charging at them. That's an example of manipulation. Yes, those may be various game rules, combined with a little bit of real-world physics logic, but that's not how in-game physics works. And if that kind of shenanigan is possible at a table, I don't really want to play at it. The spirit of the game was not to have those mechanics work in that specific way. It's just not physically possible. Of course, then there's the game master side of this. As the rules referee, as the ultimate authority on the narrative, the game master has the ability to manipulate things to one advantage or another. And usually it's detrimental to their game in that players feel a lack of agency and that their choices don't matter. A classic example of this is a game master allowing some NPC to escape, even if the player characters have resources to prevent them from doing so. A really extreme example of this is a friend of mine was at a table where an NPC was trying to escape, and she watched the dungeon master not declare their actions like they normally do. They're just kind of like, they take a bonus action, and they take a bonus action, and they looked at the other players around the table like, did he just take 2 bonus actions and then Dimension Door? And from the rest of the fight, it was clear that the NPC didn't actually have enough movement to do what the GM had them do. And the GM wasn't transparent about what they wanted. They tried to just kind of sneak it off. And again, it infringed upon the trust at the table. And that group didn't play together for very much long after. Now, something that OP is, I would say, likely feeling, and something that can also be a detriment to your D&D games is insecurity. Now with this one, we're specifically talking about it through the game master's lens. There are plenty of times you may have players that feel insecure, especially, again, if they feel like they take too long resolving their turns, like the attack roll example I did earlier, or if this is their first time playing a TTRPG, they're not quite sure how it's supposed to work. A strong GM can help guide a player like that into a feeling of security. In addition to improvisational performance, a crucial component of game mastering is leadership. And you can imagine, probably leaders from your own experience that have been insecure. Either it's a lack of confidence or belief in themselves, or it's some sort of overcompensation. The ways I've seen insecure GMing manifest at the table include some of the things that we talked about earlier. Disruption. I've actually seen GMs distract from their own game because they didn't have confidence that what they prepared was sufficient. So they'd bring up other topics, they'd allow themselves to tumble down other rabbit holes. Imbalance. If they feel like only one player cares about their game, they may latch on to that player. Or manipulation. They see things going a certain way, and when their players surprise them, they get uncomfortable and start manipulating the rules to regain a sense of control over the situation. Ultimately, this leads us to our last characteristic, which is the personality mismatch. Sometimes you and another player just don't get along. Maybe they're a min-maxer, and you're more interested in creating out-of-the-box characters that don't necessarily use optimal options. Maybe they're really rules as written, and you like a more casual, light approach to the rules. It's perfectly normal for 2 players to experience friction at the table. If it's happening more often than not, maybe it's time to evaluate the cost-benefit of participating in this game. If you really like the GM and you really are meshing with the other players, and it's really just one that you find yourself clashing with, maybe it's worth it to stick through those rough spots in order to experience the awesomeness that table has to offer. If it's starting to tread into kind of the toxic territory, where you're flinching at the idea of even showing up to a table, well, now that's where this phrase, no D&D is better than bad D&D, can come in handy. Although earlier I said it originated from toxic situations, sometimes the example isn't that extreme. You just don't jive with a personality, and that's okay. Now for the GM side of things, to reiterate, you are the leader of your table. You're the one responsible for assembling your group and making sure that everything is running as smoothly as possible. It's why in the 7 baby steps to masterful game mastering, I recommend starting with a one-shot. And that's not just for new GMs, that's also for a new player being introduced to your group. It gives you the space to kind of test out each other's styles and preferences and vibes. If things are going smoothly, you can start to commit to a slightly longer format. But if you make mistakes as a GM, or if the personalities just don't match up, the conclusion of that one shot can also now be the conclusion of that particular configuration of players. You can try different groups and mixtures of personalities until you find the one that seems like it's going to work best with the campaign you ideally want to run. To quote John Lund again, remember, all frustration is based on unmet expectations. A lot of the issues described in this particular post, I suspect, come with some kind of mismatch of expectations. For example, let's look at the in-person group, the one that thinks that weekly sessions are too frequent and 4-hour sessions are too long. And also, no one really shows up consistently. If you're running a Critical Role style game, where you're imagining 70, 80 sessions with the same characters and really in-depth plot details, then those players may not fit that campaign style. Critical Role works because of a particular chemistry between Matt Mercer, an experienced game master, and players that are professional actors that agree to a certain style of gaming. If you're a new GM and you're recognizing a lack of skill, which is a super healthy thing, I think that the first step is to make sure that the expectations of your players match the level of experience you're able to provide for them. My best sessions as a player in a new GM's game is when upfront they say, I don't really know what I'm doing, I have some ideas, I want to try them out. If I need to take a while to either process or organize new things happening, please allow me the time to do that. On the flip side of it, as a new GM, make sure that your early stories are really simple and concise. If you're going to take 20 minutes looking up a rule or setting up an encounter, expect players to play around on their phone or be a little more distracted. Don't set up a story that demands the same amount of attention as the players for Critical Role give Matt Mercer. He's at a level that he can provide a certain experience for them. You're just not there yet. What's the limit of your players' attention in a certain format? I play an infrequent, hopefully monthly game with my grandma and some family members. I play a monthly game with my grandmother, sister, and mom. Those games are sometimes as quick as 60 minutes. Sometimes they're about 2.5 hours. But I find in that environment, with that configuration of players, after about 2 hours, if that, they start to really lose their focus and get tired and want to go to bed. We can only do it when our schedules align. I'm not going to expect them to remember specific details of things that happened in previous sessions. So for them, I just bring a one-shot that's a little lighter, a little sillier, let them play around with a few things, and we wrap up the little episodic story by the end, so they can come in fresh, maybe with some memories and standout moments of a previous session, but they don't need to remember what happened in the previous session to enjoy the one I'm about to give them. That being said, when I'm running my current ongoing epic campaign, my mom and sister are both also a part of it, but instead of it being in person, it's online. And in that shifted environment, they can pay attention for 5 or 6 hours at a time. There are breaks scheduled in, and they do a much better job remembering the little details that I foreshadowed in prior sessions. The change in environment and the change in parameters and expectations lead to a much different outcome. So when I'm reading from the Reddit post here that the in-person group decided weekly sessions are too often and 4-hour sessions are too long, and nobody shows up consistently, what that's telling me is that specific format just doesn't work for that particular group. Instead, I recommend starting with one-shots. See if 3 hours is too long a time. And don't schedule weekly. Schedule when everyone is available. It may not be the kind of campaign you dream about, again like Critical Role or something like it, but you are going to get experience under your belt. And most importantly, you're going to have more successful sessions more often. And if your players are passing out at the table or playing on their phones, start with some sort of lighter story where they don't have to pay attention as much to enjoy it. And if you actually make your sessions a little less frequent, in my experience for a lot of players, it lets them show up a little bit more when they do attend. They know there's not this ongoing commitment that's dragging them down. They get to set aside a little pocket of time, knowing that they're not overly committing once that session has resolved. In a lot of ways, it actually builds momentum and can get players excited to do more and more D&D, especially if you start getting stronger as a GM for each of those individual sessions. And if some players aren't available sometimes, they don't feel left out for when the next time comes up and they are available. In fact, in my experience, that was one of the primary reasons a lot of groups fizzled. Something would come up, legitimate, for like a session or two. Maybe that was the season where my friends' kids had chorus concerts or dance recitals. They're not able to make it that session. Well, if the game goes on and they miss out on some key story things, they feel left out when they do return. And one of the ways that they defend themselves is to just engage a little less, which starts a downward spiral that leads to the game fizzling. So, for OP, my advice would be, let your players know up front. Admit that you think you have a skill issue as a GM. Change the format to give yourself the grace of making mistakes and not demanding too much of your players. Set your session up so it's easy for them to help you. And if your players aren't ready to commit to a longer form story arc or something that's much more in-depth or cathartic, that's okay. That's a lot of players. Even if all of your players are close friends. One painful lesson I've learned is that close friends do not necessarily equate to fun D&D companions. There are plenty of close friends I can think of that we get along great with D&D. We've been playing the same campaign for years. There are other close friends I can think of where our views or preferences in relation to TTRPGs are so different that it's not as fun playing together. There are other things we connect about, but to get the most out of a TTRPG, it requires certain kinds of agreements be made up front. And, unfortunately, part of the gig is knowing going in, games will fizzle. You'll have incomplete campaigns. You'll have sessions where you think you could have done better. Sometimes your players will say, "We're having a great time," and you won't believe them. Sometimes it is because they're just trying to be polite. And there have been plenty of times I think I've messed something up in a session, but my players genuinely believe that it was an awesome game. So I know it's painful to hear, but sometimes the best thing for a game is to let it fizzle, is to kind of let it go. Even if it's with close friends and you don't think you'll get the chance to play again, you may surprise yourself how opportunities present themselves. And not even necessarily with strangers. When I first ran D&D, I did such a bad job. I was literally writing out the player characters' lines to have them read at the table. It was a nightmare. And after that game fizzled, I truly believed I was never going to play D&D again. Well, a few years passed and I actually did get my chance to be a player in somebody else's game. I picked myself back up and here we are today. Just keep playing around with different formats. Be aware of how people actually think and actually play. Read the room. You'll be amazed at the skill improvements that you get in such a short period of time. So that's my advice for OP's dilemma here. What advice would you give them? Were there any parts of Unsatisfying D&D that I missed that you think need further elaboration? And are there any topics in particular you'd like me to cover? Let me know in the comments down below. Hit like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.